Let's say you make a shirt. You physically plant the cotton into the ground, you tend to the cotton all through the process of its growth, then you pick the ball from the stalk and separate the seeds from the ball. Then you do everything that needs to be done to turn that cotton into a shirt. You mine the minerals from the ground and create the chemicals needed to get the cotton to clump up in a shirt-like consistency, sewing the patches together, etc. You have created this shirt from start to finish. There's no ambiguity as to whose labor resulted in the creation of that shirt. Do you now own this shirt? Well, if you're Robinson Crusoe, the idea of ownership doesn't have much meaning. If there are a bunch of people around you, however, then you can use that shirt to the extent that others will let you use it, that they won't rip it off your back. If they don't believe that you own that shirt for whatever reason, and the mob rips the shirt off your back, then practically speaking, you do not own that shirt. There's no objective ownership. When you make a shirt, it doesn't then physically attach to your body, and that would only matter if people around you agree that you own the body the brain associated with your subjective perception is attached to. All ownership is based on an intersubjective consensus. What I mean by intersubjective consensus is just that. Subjective, what each subject, in this case a person, thinks. Inter, relating to each other. Intersubjective, what people think about something in relation to each other. Consensus, something agreed upon, not to be confused with voted upon. It can be voted upon if people believe that the voting makes something legitimate. I do not mean subjective consensus, as that could mean 5 communists in a city of 1 million people having a different belief about what constitutes ownership. Even if those 5 people don't like the private property arrangements of that city, they recognize and respect private property because private property is overwhelmingly supported in that city. It is the intersubjective consensus. And inter means in relation to the other relevant subjects, whoever those might be, and some people are more relevant than others. Sure, the 5 communists have a consensus of communal ownership, but they have to deal with the rest of the city, so they must consent to the property arrangements of everyone else in the city if they want to get along. If those 5 communists moved into an uninhabited area, and this area was not claimed by a state, then the intersubjective consensus in that area, as it pertained to property ownership, would in fact be communistic, whatever the specifics of that are. That the people living in the city have a different consensus as to what constitutes ownership is immaterial to these communists now, and does not intrude on the intersubjective consensus of the now free 5 communists. The intersubjective consensus is not something I am advocating, it is just a description. Intersubjective consensus is a term I use to describe reality. Of course, there is no actual intersubjective consensus in the singular any more than there is a forest or herd of buffalo in the singular. There are trees, buffalo, and individual actions and agreements, and like a forest or herd, intersubjective consensus is just a conceptual box. When you buy something from 7-Eleven, why is it then agreed that you own that which you bought? When you buy the slushie, does the material nature of the slushie change? No, but when you give the cashier the requested funny money, it is then perceived that you own that slushie. Land works the same way. You own your home because the relevant subjects around you agree that you do. It is the intersubjective consensus that you own that home that the land is on. Ownership for a home works no differently than the ownership of the shirt on your back. This is a very basic outline of the intersubjective consensus as it pertains to ownership. Typically, people refer to statements of various institutions to determine ownership. For example, in the territories of the western United States before those areas became incorporated, the settlers formed claims associations. They would decide upon what exactly constituted ownership of land. They may decide that farming an area for 6 months within any 12-month period constitutes ownership of any plot of land. Leaving a field fallow for a period of longer than 6 months within any 12-month period will result in the forfeiture of that land to whoever proceeds to cultivate instead. Squatter's law. Thus, the dictates of the claims association becomes the criteria of ownership agreed upon by the people in that area. They could agree upon an election to determine ownership if they wanted to. That becomes the intersubjective consensus of property ownership. Some person may decide he does not like this arrangement, but he will have to contend with his neighbor's belief that the dictates of the association are legitimate, which is to say he will have to go up against the intersubjective consensus in that area, and this is not very fun at all. But one may say, isn't this just a small state? No, not in the slightest. I've described what I think property and ownership are based on, and from now on will no longer regularly deal at that low level of abstraction. I am boxing this concept, so instead of saying, Bob owns a shirt according to the relevant subjects around him, I will just say, Bob owns a shirt. If a conflict ever arises as to who owns what, I will unbox the concept and deal with ownership at the more basic level. Now the state needs to be defined. The state is an entity which exerts a measure of de jure authority over an area it has not acquired ownership of by a commonly agreed upon criteria of ownership, or more succinctly, it is a land monopoly. For example, while you may have to build up so many improvements per acre or farm land for a period of time, the state can just pass an act through Congress and declare 10,000 acres of wetland preserve or national park land, and they can make you pay rent on land that you supposedly own. They call this rent property tax. The state is made up of people, like a company, and these people rotate in and out, and after many years you can have a completely different set of people who make up the state. The state is typically an institution, and I do not feel compelled to address more exotic states. An example of more exotic states would be like an individual man who is viewed as the state, and when he dies, the state dies, or a religious cult that believes everyone in the world should make some sacrifice to the gods, and so the people in this cult force everyone else to do so, even though there is no formal institution carrying out the coercion. It's just a bunch of crazed mystics going around coercing people into sacrificing to the gods. So you have the ideology and the marginal coercion. Just dealing with things like the United States or Canada or Germany or things like that. For example, a claims association only deals with land its members are living on. All land not being homesteaded by members of the claims association is not claimed by the claims association. If one wishes to live outside the property of a person a part of the claims association, they will do so. A state, however, will claim a large body of land and issue a fiat decree, perhaps a property tax. That is, by living on land claimed by whoever makes up the state, you are said to be living within the borders of X state, and are subject to the laws and taxes of that state. The state does not acquire property the same way non-state subjects do. This can get fuzzy in theory, but in practice it is not ambiguous what is and what isn't a state. For example, females may have different things that they have to do to acquire ownership than males, but it would be silly to say that women or men are now the state. The ability of the state to issue decrees pertaining to anyone living in the area of their claim is based primarily on belief, the ideology of the state as being legitimate. This is not to say that individuals will like the state any more than they will like respecting the property of some crank, but they will view such things as legitimate. Belief is what maintains private property, and private property is necessary for the buildup of capital and people producing things that people want. Belief is also what maintains the state, which I consider a perversion of this belief structure. Though a value-free analysis will conclude that a state is just another type of intersubjective consensus of ownership, which it is, but it is a highly destructive one. When one says, we are the state, this is what they mean. It's not true, you are not the state, but because the state is considered legitimate, because it's part of the intersubjective consensus of that which is valid, many mistakenly view the state as part of them. They'll say, we are the state. My opinion is that the state is a perversion of the tendency among many species to assign ownership of property to individuals. For a state to come about in the first place, people must believe in ownership, because without ownership, how can the institution of the state be said to have typically limited ownership of such vast territories they have never touched? It cannot. This is why many anarchists wish to abolish private property altogether, that is, they want to drive private property out of the intersubjective consensus worldwide. This cannot be done, as private property is crucial for a sustainable structure of production to come about. An analogy would be that one shouldn't cease to be offended by grotesque injustice just because he realizes that ethics are contrived. Within the Claims Association, there may be individuals who greatly object to the rules of the Claims Association. An objecting individual may lobby to get those rules changed, and succeed or fail to acquire whatever individualistic secessions he's lobbying for, whatever. This is apparently similar to the state, though it isn't for the reasons stated in the previous section. If he is unable to acquire secessions from the relevant agents of the Claims Association, and still tries to do whatever it is he wanted to do, that is, say he wants to start a pig farm and they're saying no, and a pig farm smells really bad, it's not like, ha ha, who farted bad, more like, I can't even think bad. If he tries to do this, he will face force from whoever is assigned to use force against those who shirk the decrees of the Claims Association. Thus, force is used at the margins in the Claims Association. One can call the folks assigned to violently enforce the rules of the Claims Association the marginal association, and the people who founded and convinced people to join the association as the ideological association. You may say I'm overanalyzing all this stuff, but I have a point to this. However, if an individual holds sufficient antipathy toward the rules of the Claims Association, he will most likely leave. Either he will just pack up his bags and go somewhere else, leave the geographic area of the association member's property, or he will trade land with someone on the geographic fringe of the association and secede from the association in that way. Fill in the technicalities as you will, and spare the world and your own mind of silly thoughts about donut scenarios or encirclement scenarios. One cannot leave or secede from the state as it stands. The way we know this is that the bulk of the population of the planet hasn't seceded from the various states, or at least a sizable portion has not. The state is maintained the same way the Claims Association is maintained, primarily through belief that the state/Claims Association is the best thing to do or is legitimate, and through force on the margins. The vast majority of people view the state as legitimate. Some may not like Bush, or they may not like Obama for whatever reason, and say, he's not my president, but they are not saying that the United States government, as an institution through time, is illegitimate. And supporters of the state need not be gung-ho patriotic flag worshippers or constitution fetishizers, but can be resigned to the state as some inevitable law of nature, like death and taxes, or view it as a necessary evil, saying something trite like, yeah, I hate taxes as much as the next guy, but the roads have got to be built somehow. More detail is necessary for this, but for now let's just work from the point that the vast majority, say 98% of people in the area claimed by the United States federal government, believe the state is legitimate. So the vast majority supports the state and pays taxes, which enables the state to hire soldiers and police. I'm not saying that state police are completely worthless at all times. That is just an issue for another section, but police can be called upon to put the screws to tax resistors. If a person avoids paying taxes, he will get hit with a late penalty. If he refuses to pay the late penalty plus the taxes, he will then have a trial where the legitimacy of the state is assumed, and he will be sentenced to prison. If he resists being sent to prison, and that means defending his home with firearms against home invaders, he will be killed by the state police force, which is paid for by taxes. And the police force will claim to be that they were enforcing the law, and in the process of enforcing the law, they defended themselves from a tax evader, and put a bullet in the tax evader's head. That is the marginal state. That is how cracks in the ideological state are prevented from forming. Because if anyone was allowed to secede, you would then have cascading secession. A few trailblazers would step out into the boogeyman world of anarchy, and, well, it'd be fine, and then more would leave. And soon, only the most deranged cultists would cling to the state. And so to prevent this, the state cannot afford to let a single man secede, lest the others start getting any ideas. Now, they may let a few wackos go live up in the hills, but they won't be letting, for example, a town secede and say, we're going to opt out of the income tax and just pay our own way. They won't allow that. Killing tax resistors doesn't happen very often, because when most receive a fine, they pay it, and most humans have a revulsion against killing, and so any state agency that killed a tax resistor would not be very popular, and state agents themselves are humans, and humans have a revulsion to killing other humans themselves, and these agents of the state are not inhuman, they're just part of a corrupt institution. What's more is that repeated use of force destroys the ideology. It weakens the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the citizens. States which repeatedly use force on their own citizens are very weak states, because it means that there is a large percentage of the people who are kept in line by force alone and don't believe in the official ideology. And I call this a high percentage marginal state. A man holding up a bank and holding up everyone inside the bank as hostage would be a 100% marginal state. The people in the bank are held up by force alone. They do not project legitimacy onto the enforcer, although over time they will slowly begin to project legitimacy onto this man in what is known as the Stockholm Syndrome. I apologize for the cliche metaphor I'm about to bring up, but this is similar to the sheep and the sheepdog. If a flock of sheep were all to rush against the sheepdog and the herder in a uniform attack, the sheepdog and the herder would be overwhelmed. A few sheep may die, and if this were the movie Babe, then those sheep would be remembered as martyrs of the revolution. Without belief in either the legitimacy or overwhelming force of the sheepdog, the sheep would go their own way. And even with a belief, a few sheep still stray, still go off in their own areas, and the sheepdog and herder are needed to herd the sheep back into the flock on the margins, to prevent cascading secession of the entire flock. If you resist hard enough, the guns will eventually come out, and the true nature of the state will be revealed. Now, I haven't gone much into the utilitarian superiority of the stateless society, or even how various sundries would be managed, like roads, defense, safety and health regulations, police, law, the free rider problem, scientific research, humanitarian services, the monetary system, etc. But I just wanted to lay out the very basics, how ownership works, how associations work, and how the state works in a basic sense. Also, hopefully, if one really internalizes this basic, inescapable fact that the state is enforced at the margins by death, he will see that at the bottom of it all, the state is a death cult, and that one should not be so casual in advocating state action, even if you views it as a necessary evil. Because by doing so, you are advocating death threats. That is, you are arranging and pointing the guns in certain directions to achieve the desired results, even though most people are trained not to see the guns.
Fuck you!